He grabbed her pack and threw it into the dirt right in front of everyone. Master Chief Jonas Graves stood over it, looked down at Ava Vance and said it loud enough for every man on that base to hear. "Pack your things and get off my range before I have you physically removed." She was 17. She hadn't fired a single shot, hadn't said a single word. And this decorated combat-hardened SEAL was already trying to break her, not in training, not on a course, but standing in open desert, in front of his men with his boot inches from everything she'd carried onto that base. Before we go any further, if you're watching this for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The transport vehicle stopped at 0530 hours. The desert was already awake, not the kind of awake that feels gentle or slow. The Nevada desert in summer wakes up the way a furnace door swings open. Heat radiates up from the sand before the sun has even fully crested the ridgeline. The air smells like dry rock, and something electric, like the land itself, is daring you to stay. Ava Vance stepped off the vehicle, and she did it the same way she did everything, without announcement. She didn't stumble. She didn't shield her eyes from the rising light. She just stepped down, both boots hitting the ground at the same time, and she stood there for exactly 3 seconds, taking in the base before she reached back into the transport and pulled out her pack. She was 17 years old, 5'4", 128 pounds on a day when she'd eaten well. She had dark brown hair pulled back with the kind of practical tightness that suggested she wasn't thinking about it at all. Her face was still not nervous, still not trying to look brave, just still. The way a lake is still before something large moves underneath it. Nobody came to greet her. That was by design. The evaluation program that had placed Ava Vance on that transport was controversial before she ever packed her bag. Joint assessment protocols between civilian prodigy programs and active military training pipelines were rare, politically charged, and deeply resented by the men who operated inside those pipelines. The Navy SEALs in particular had made their feelings known through official channels and unofficial ones, which mostly meant that the men at this base had been talking about her arrival for 3 weeks, and none of those conversations had been kind. She walked toward the main processing building, pack on her back, and she passed 4 men standing near a vehicle who didn't bother to lower their voices. "There she is," the first one said. His name was Kowalski, a big man with a short neck and the kind of arms that suggested he'd been lifting things since he was 12 years old. He had 8 years with the teams, 3 combat deployments, a scar along his brow from an extraction gone sideways in a country he wasn't supposed to be in. He looked at Ava the way someone looks at a wrong order at a restaurant. "That's actually what they sent us." "She looks like should be at prom," said the second man, whose name was Decker. He laughed at his own joke. "She looks like she should be at middle school," Kowalski corrected. The third man, Reyes, compact and dark-eyed and usually quieter than the others, didn't laugh. He just watched her. That was a distinction nobody noticed at the time, but it would matter later. Ava heard every word. She kept walking. That was the first thing that should have told them something. Most people, even trained people, when they hear themselves being mocked, do something. A jaw tightens, a shoulder shifts. The walking pace changes by a half step. It's involuntary, a physiological response to social threat that almost nobody can fully suppress. Ava Vance walked at exactly the same pace with exactly the same posture and disappeared through the processing door. Kowalski watched her go. "Week," he said. "I give her a week before she's crying on a transport back to wherever they found her." 5 days, said Decker. 3, said a fourth voice, and that one belonged to Master Chief Jonas Graves, who had come around the corner of the building without any of them hearing him approach, which was itself a reminder of why the man had the position he had. Graves was not a physically intimidating man the way Kowalski was. He was medium height, medium build, the kind of man who disappeared in crowds until you looked at his eyes, and then you didn't look away quickly enough and something happened in the space behind your sternum that you couldn't name. He was 51 years old. He had been a SEAL for over 2 decades. He had trained hundreds of candidates and watched most of them fail. And the ones who made it through remembered him the way you remember the worst winter of your life, with a complicated respect that takes years to fully understand. He looked at the door Ava had just walked through. 3 days, he said again, quieter this time, not to anyone in particular. She'll make it 3 days because she's proud, then she'll be gone. He didn't say it with a cruelty. He said it the way a mechanic diagnoses an engine clinically based on pattern recognition built over decades. He had seen every version of the motivated recruit, the ones who trained hard their whole lives, the ones who were the best athletes in their county, their state, their program. He had seen them walk through that same door carrying the absolute certainty of their own ability, and he had watched that certainty get extracted from them like water from a sponge methodically over days until what was left was either something real or nothing at all. He had never seen what was behind that door before, not in this particular form. And because of that, his pattern recognition for the first time in a long time was about to fail him completely. But he didn't know that yet. Inside the processing building, Ava sat in a plastic chair with her pack between her feet and waited. A young administrative specialist named Briggs, 22, fresh, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment of processing her, slid a stack of forms across the desk and didn't make eye contact. "You can fill these out and I've already completed the digital versions," Ava said. Her voice was even, not aggressive, not overly polite, just factual. "They should be in the system." Briggs checked his screen. They were. Every form, filed correctly, 48 hours in advance. He looked at her for the first time. "Right," he said. "Okay. What time does orientation begin?" 0700. "Where? South Compound, Building C." "Thank you." She picked up her pack. "Is there somewhere I can store this until then?" Briggs pointed to a row of lockers along the wall. She nodded, walked to them, chose one efficiently. Not the closest one, not a random one, but one in the middle of the row that gave her a clear sight line to both the entrance and the administrative desk, and she stored her pack with the lock code entered in under 4 seconds. Briggs watched her go and then looked at his screen and then looked at the door and then went back to his screen and thought about it for a while. Orientation at 0700 was held in a large room with folding chairs set in rows, and it was attended by 12 candidates who had come through various programs to participate in this joint evaluation cycle. Ava was the only female. She was also by a significant margin the youngest person in the room. The next youngest was a 23-year-old from a Marine reconnaissance program named Holloway, who sat next to her not out of solidarity, but because it was the nearest available chair, and who glanced at her once and then away again with the expression of a person recalibrating their assumptions. Master Chief Graves entered the room at exactly 0700, not 1 second early. Not 1 second late. He walked to the front and stood there and looked at all of them one face at a time, moving his gaze with the deliberate slowness of a man who has done this enough times to know that the looking itself is a test. When his eyes reached Ava, they stopped for exactly the same duration as they'd stopped on everyone else. Not longer, not shorter. He was not going to give her special attention, not the hostile kind, and not any other kind. "You are here," he said, "because someone somewhere believed that this was a good idea. Whether or not that belief has any foundation in reality is something we are going to find out together. I want you to understand something before we start." He paused and the room was very quiet. "I don't care who you are. I don't care what you've done. I don't care what program sent you here or what evaluation you passed to get on that transport. Out there," he gestured, a single motion toward the desert outside the walls. "None of that means anything. Out there you are what you demonstrate, nothing less, nothing more." He let that sit in the air. "Some of you," he continued, "are going to fail. Most of you statistically are going to fail. That is not an insult. That is a fact. The question is not whether you fail. The question is what kind of failure you choose to be." "Do you understand?" 12 voices said yes in a ragged chorus. Graves looked at them all for another moment. "We start in 20 minutes. Wear your kit." He walked out. Nobody said anything for a beat. Then Holloway next to Ava exhaled through his nose. "Well," he said, "that was warm." Ava didn't respond. She was already thinking about what came next. The first day's activities were structured to accomplish one thing: a baseline assessment disguised as an introduction. Graves and his cadre ran every candidate through a physical fitness circuit, not to their limits, but just under, so the cadre could observe movement patterns, breathing control, response to instruction, and recovery rate. It was like the first page of a book. The information on it was simple, but everything that followed depended on reading it correctly. Ava ran the initial circuit in silence. She was not the fastest runner in the group. She was third. But the two men who finished ahead of her were both over 6 feet tall with stride advantages of 4 to 6 inches, which meant that in terms of mechanical efficiency relative to body size, she was the most effective runner on the course. Graves' senior instructor, a chief petty officer named Callahan, who was built like a question mark and had eyes that missed very little, noted this in his clipboard assessment and didn't say anything to anyone about it. During the obstacle course segment, something interesting happened. There was a section involving a horizontal cargo net suspended 12 feet above the ground, roughly 40 feet long, requiring candidates to traverse it in full kit. The technique most people used was a brute force method, upper body strength, pull and push, get across as fast as possible and accept the burn. 3 of the larger candidates went across this way, and they were fast, but 2 of them were visibly winded on the other side. Ava looked at the net for about 4 seconds. Then she went across it differently. She distributed her weight across 4 points of contact instead of 2, kept her center of gravity lower than the net's suspension angle, and moved in a controlled rhythm that looked almost slow until you realized she'd covered 30 feet before the man ahead of her had recovered enough to complete his last 10. Callahan's pen touched his clipboard again. Behind him, Kowalski had been watching from the side of the course with the practiced boredom of a man who'd run evaluations like this 100 times. He saw what Ava did on the net. He didn't write anything down. But the boredom on his face changed briefly into something that wasn't quite a frown and wasn't quite surprise, something in between that he resolved quickly by looking away. At lunch break, Ava sat slightly apart from the main group, not dramatically separate, not sulking, just at the end of the table eating efficiently and watching. Several of the other candidates exchanged introductions. She listened to every conversation she was near without contributing to them. By the time the break ended, she knew which of the 12 candidates were operating on pure aggression, which ones were performing for evaluation, which ones were genuinely competent, and which one Holloway was concealing a left shoulder issue that was going to cost him on the weighted carries. She filed every piece of this information away. That afternoon, the temperature reached 108 degrees. Graves made the announcement about the heat like he was reading a weather report. Casual, entirely without sympathy. The afternoon session would involve a 6-mile loaded movement at variable pace, what the cadre called a ruck, with a 50-pound pack on every back. The terrain was mixed flats, inclines, loose rocks, soft sand. This was where the first real separation happened. By mile 2, the group had stretched into a long, ragged line. The fastest man at the front, a former collegiate wrestler named Brixton, was pushing a pace that worked for his body type and his level of pure physical preparation. The slowest 2 candidates were already showing signs of heat stress. One of them pulled up at mile 2.4 with cramping and was quietly evaluated out of the day's activity by a medical corpsman who had been following the group in a vehicle. Ava was in the middle of the pack through mile 3. Then something shifted. She didn't speed up, exactly. It was more like the people around her slowed down in response to accumulating fatigue, and she didn't slow with them. The gap between her and the men around her grew not because she was accelerating, but because she was maintaining. Her pace at mile 3.5 was identical to her pace at mile 1. Her breathing was controlled. Her posture was correct. By mile 4.5, she had moved to the front third of the group. Graves was watching from a parallel vehicle track 50 meters off the main route. He drove slowly beside the column, occasionally glassing individual candidates with binoculars. When his observation window found Ava, he held it there for a moment longer than usual. Her gait was slightly asymmetrical. He noticed it. Left heel strike was about 15 milliseconds earlier than optimal. Compensation pattern. She was managing something, a discomfort in her right side, he guessed, but she had adjusted her movement mechanics to account for it rather than either ignoring it or stopping. That was not a beginner's response. That was the response of someone who had been taught to listen to their body rather than fight it. He lowered the binoculars. He didn't speak. At mile 5, Holloway's shoulder gave out. He didn't go down. He had more discipline than that, but his pack slipped and he caught it one-handed, and the pain that crossed his face was visible for about a second before he locked it down. He kept moving. Nobody acknowledged it except Ava, who had dropped back slightly in the last half mile and was now running at his pace. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't offer to help with his pack. She just moved beside him for about 200 meters. Then, without explanation, she drifted back to her own pace and pulled ahead. Later, when asked about it, Holloway said, "I don't know, it just felt like she was checking something, like she was running a quick diagnostic and then went back to her own work. He finished mile 6. Ava finished mile 6 4 minutes and 12 seconds ahead of him, third overall. In the debrief that followed, Graves stood in front of the group, sweat-soaked, sun-blasted, several of them clearly running on fumes, and asked each candidate to give a one-sentence assessment of their own performance. Not what they did well, what they needed to work on. One by one they answered, mostly honest, a few diplomatic. When he got to Ava, he paused a fraction of a second longer than he'd paused for any of the others. Maybe he was expecting her to be different in some way he couldn't predict. Maybe he was daring her to say something he could use. She said right side hip flexor started tightening at mile 3. I compensated correctly, but I need to adjust my pre-movement stretching protocol to prevent it from starting as early. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Just nobody spoke for a moment. Callahan, standing to Graves's left, looked up from his clipboard. Graves looked at Ava for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have. Then he moved on to the next candidate. After the debrief, after the candidates had dispersed to their quarters, Callahan fell into step beside Graves on the way back to the command building. She self-diagnosed the hip issue, Callahan said. I know, Graves said, without slowing down. I know. And she checked on Holloway's shoulder. Graves stopped walking. He turned and looked at Callahan with an expression that was very flat and very hard to read. Chief, he said. Sir. She's been here 12 hours. Yes, sir. She hasn't passed anything yet. Callahan nodded slowly. No, sir. So why are you talking to me like she has? Callahan considered this. He was a careful man by nature. He thought before he spoke, which was one of the things that made him effective and one of the things that occasionally made him annoying to people who didn't want to hear what he'd actually thought about. Because he said carefully, in 12 hours, she has demonstrated more tactical self-awareness than 4 of our current candidates combined, and I thought you'd want to know before tomorrow. Graves looked at him for a moment, then he turned and kept walking. She's here for 3 days, he said. That's my assessment, and it stands. But something in the way he said it was slightly different than the way he'd said it that morning. Not softer, just less certain. The way a mathematical answer sounds when you've run the calculation correctly, but the result surprises you and you suspect you might want to run it again. Callahan didn't push it. He just kept walking alongside the Master Chief and didn't say anything else. That night, Ava lay in her bunk in the small, separate quarters they'd assigned her, the separation itself being another form of institutional messaging, another way of saying, you are not quite one of us, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark and ran through the day the way her father had taught her. Her father, Robert Vance, had been a lot of things in his life, but the thing he was most purely the thing that existed at the center of him, like a structural beam, was a man who understood how to see clearly. He'd been a long-range marksman in a context that didn't get discussed at dinner tables. And then he'd been a trainer, and then he'd been retired, and then he'd been sick, and then he'd been gone. But before any of that, from the time Ava was old enough to hold a conversation, he had been teaching her, not just marksmanship, that was the visible part, the part with a target and a rifle and a measured distance. The deeper part was about systems, about how any situation, any environment, any group of people, any problem was a system with logic you could learn if you paid attention to the right things. People tell you who they are in the first hour, he used to say. Most people spend that hour talking. You spend it listening. She had spent today listening. She knew that Kowalski was more insecure than he appeared. His dominance behavior was loud because it was compensatory. The men who were truly confident in their ability, Callahan and she suspected Graves himself, were the quietest observers in the room. She knew that 3 of the 12 candidates were performance-focused rather than task-focused. They wanted to be seen doing well more than they wanted to actually do well. That was a distinction that didn't matter much in the short term, but was catastrophic in high-pressure situations. She knew that Reyes was watching her the way she was watching everyone else. That made him interesting. She knew that Holloway was going to have to declare his shoulder before day 3, or he was going to hurt himself, and that the choice he made about that would tell her a great deal about his character. And she knew that Graves had clocked her hip compensation. That last part was both a concern and a data point. A concern because it meant she had a physical limitation that was visible to a trained observer before she'd even gotten to the parts of this evaluation that actually mattered. A data point because the fact that Graves had noticed it and not said anything about it not used it, not flagged it for medical, suggested that he was watching rather than reacting, that he was processing rather than judging. That was the behavior of a precise mind, which meant she concluded lying in the dark with the desert cooling around her and the distant sound of wind moving through dry air that the most dangerous person on this base was not Kowalski, who would come at you loud, not Decker, who would come at you with mockery, not the half-dozen institutional forces aligned against her presence here. The most dangerous person was the quiet one who ran the calculations. She would have to be very, very careful with Jonas Graves. And she would have to be very, very good. She closed her eyes and she slept, and the sleep was clean and without disturbance, and when the alarm sounded at 0400, she was awake before it finished its first tone. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listened to the bass, listened to the desert outside the thin walls. Then she rose and began preparing for day 2. Because whatever Graves believed about how many days she had left here, whatever count he was running in his head, whatever deadline his pattern recognition had assigned to her, she had a different number in mind entirely. She wasn't here for 3 days. She wasn't here for a week. She was here until she had demonstrated every single thing she'd come to demonstrate, and no man's assumption, no institutional resistance, no amount of laughter from men who didn't know what they were looking at was going to alter that timeline by a single day. Her father had taught her patience as a discipline, not a personality trait. Patience was a weapon when you understood how to use it. And Ava Vance, 17 years old, standing in the pre-dawn dark of a Nevada desert, had been loading that weapon for a very long time. Day 2 was coming, and so was the desert, and so was everything that neither of them could yet see. Day 2 started before the sun. Ava was already at the assembly point when the first cadre member arrived, and that cadre member was Callahan. And Callahan stopped walking when he saw her standing there in full kit with her pack squared and her hands at her sides. And he looked at his watch, and then he looked at her, and he didn't say anything. He just made a small sound in the back of his throat and walked past her to set up the morning brief. She had been there for 11 minutes before anyone else arrived. The other candidates filtered in over the next several minutes, most of them wearing the particular expression of people who had not slept as well as they needed to. Holloway arrived with his left arm slightly stiff at the shoulder. He was managing it, but the morning cold had settled into whatever was wrong in that joint, and the compensation was visible if you knew what to look for. Ava knew what to look for. Kowalski arrived loud the way he always arrived, talking to Decker about something that made both of them laugh. He glanced at Ava when he came in, and the glance lasted about a second, and then he looked away and said something lower to Decker that she couldn't hear but could interpret from the angle of his jaw. Graves arrived at exactly 0500. He looked at the assembled group the same way he'd looked at them yesterday, methodically face by face, and when he reached Ava, he paused for exactly the same duration he had paused for every other candidate. She had already decided this would be her primary challenge with him. He was disciplined enough to treat her identically to the others on the surface, which meant the real information was going to come from the moments when that discipline slipped even slightly. A quarter second longer on a look, a barely perceptible adjustment to the flatness in his voice. She was collecting those fractions the way her father had taught her to collect wind data before a long shot, patiently, precisely knowing that enough fractions eventually added up to something true. Day 2, Graves said, yesterday was introduction, today is information. Your body told us what it can do. Today we find out what your mind does when your body starts to fail. He paused. 3-mile weighted run, then obstacle, then a tactical decision drill under heat stress. Any questions? Nobody asked any questions. That was partly training culture, and partly the fact that Graves's tone made questions feel structurally inappropriate, like raising your hand in the middle of an earthquake. Move! The 3-mile weighted run began. The pack weight was 60 pounds, this time 10 more than yesterday's loaded movement, and the pace was not left to individual determination. The cadre set it a relentless mid-range pace that was specifically calculated to be sustainable for trained operators and not quite sustainable for anyone operating below that threshold. It was a designed pressure valve, too slow to be merciful, fast enough to find ceilings. By the half-mile mark, the group had already begun to fracture. Not collapse fracture, tiny separations between individuals that would widen over the next 2.5 miles into something meaningful. The man named Brixton was out front again, eating the pace the way he'd eaten everything yesterday, all engine and forward momentum. 4 men clustered behind him in a working group, then a gap, then several more candidates in various states of managed suffering. Ava ran in the middle of the pack through the first mile. She was not running to place. She was running to observe. At this pace under this load, the psychological tells came out faster than they did at lower intensity. The men who started talking to themselves under their breath. The ones whose eyes went distant and inward. The ones who checked the distance markers too frequently. The ones who didn't check them at all because checking made it worse. She was building a psychological map of every candidate around her, and she was doing it while managing a 60-pound pack in 65-degree pre-dawn air that would be 105 degrees by the time this run was finished. Callahan was running alongside the group at the edge of the track, not with them, just adjacent, watching. His eyes moved across candidates the way a camera pans a scene, smooth, continuous, missing nothing. At mile 1.4, the first significant thing happened. A candidate named Torres Quiet 20s from a Marine Force recon program suddenly altered his stride. Not a stumble, not a collapse. A stride change which was the physical equivalent of a yellow warning light. Ava saw it from 6 meters back. She saw him make a micro-adjustment to his left hip, saw the pack shift slightly as he compensated, saw the way his right arm swung differently for 3 strides before he consciously corrected it. He was about to have a mechanical problem. She watched him for another 30 seconds to confirm. The pattern repeated. She made a decision. She came up alongside Torres without announcing herself. "Your left IT band," she said quietly. Not a question. Torres looked at her sideways without turning his head, which itself required more coordination than most people appreciated at this pace. "What a iliotibial band. Left side, it's pulling. You're compensating with your hip, and it's shifting your pack weight right." Torres was quiet for 2 full strides. "Then how do you know that?" "Your right arm's swing changed. When the band pulls, your core compensates before your brain catches up. The arm is a tell." 2 more strides. His breathing was controlled, but audible. "What do I do?" "Shorten your left stride by about 4 inches. Let the hip open more. The band will stop pulling against the knee." She watched him try it. 1 stride, 2, 3. His arm swing normalized. His pack settled. "That's," he started. "Don't thank me," she said. "You've got 1.5 miles left." She drifted back to her own pace. Callahan had been watching from the side. He didn't write on his clipboard this time. He just watched. And then he looked ahead to where Graves was stationed at the 2-mile water point, and something moved across his face that was close to the expression of a man who has been quietly building a case for something and just got a piece of evidence he didn't expect. The 2-mile water point was a brief stop, 90 seconds mandatory hydration, pack weight confirmed still on every back. Graves stood at the point and watched candidates come through. When Ava arrived, she took her water, drank the required amount, capped her bottle, and checked her hip flexor with 2 fingers pressed against the right side of her waistband, checking the tissue response, just feeling, and then she re-squared her pack. "Vance," Graves said. She looked at him. "Sir, what did you tell Torres back there?" She didn't miss a beat. "Iliotibial adjustment." He was developing a compensation pattern that would have progressed to knee stress by mile 3. Graves looked at her for a moment. His expression was completely unreadable, which by now she recognized as one of his primary modes. "You a medic?" "No, sir." "You have medical training, basic anatomy and movement mechanics. My father was particular about understanding the machine before you use it." The 90 seconds were almost up. Around them, candidates were preparing to move again. Graves looked at her for 1 more second. Then he said, "Move." And she moved, and he watched her go. Behind him, Kowalski had come through the water point and had been close enough to overhear the exchange. He looked at Graves's back with something working in his face that was not quite what it had been yesterday. Less certainty, more calculation. He didn't say anything. He moved. The 3rd mile was where the heat arrived. The sun had fully cleared the ridgeline by the time the group hit mile 2.5, and the desert did what the desert does. It took the light and amplified it off every surface, off the canyon and the pale rock and the dry air itself, until the temperature climbed through 90 and kept going. By mile 3, it was approaching 98 degrees. The cadre had planned this. The timing of the run was deliberate so that the final push would be executed in building heat. This was not cruelty. This was information gathering. Heat stress at the end of physical exertion was one of the most reliable filters for true operational readiness. because the mind starts making deals with itself under those conditions, starts negotiating with the body, starts suggesting that stopping is a reasonable and mature decision. The candidates who ignored those negotiations and finished anyway were showing the cadre something real. Ava's hip flexor was talking to her, not screaming, talking. She had been monitoring it since mile 2, tracking the quality of the sensation with the same attention she would give to wind data direction intensity, whether it was increasing or stable. It was not increasing. It was stable discomfort, the kind that could be managed, and she was managing it, but she was aware that managing it was costing her something, a fraction of her processing capacity, a small tax on her concentration. She paid it and kept running. Brixton finished first again, then 2 of the cluster group, then a gap, then Ava fourth, overall 3 seconds behind the third-place man. Her time on the 3-mile was 44 seconds faster than her mile equivalent pace from yesterday's 6-mile, which was a significant and counterintuitive data point. She ran faster under heavier load over the shorter distance, which suggested she had been deliberately pacing yesterday rather than running near her ceiling. Callahan noted this without comment. Graves noted this without any visible reaction at all. Kowalski finished 7th, which was where he usually finished on runs, because his body type was built for carries and climbs and water work, not for pace over ground. He came in breathing hard and looked at the finishing order posted on the cadre board and found Ava's name above his own and stood there looking at it for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable. Decker came up beside him. "Huh," Decker said, looking at the board. "Don't," Kowalski said. Don't." The obstacle course followed after a 20-minute rest, and this was where the morning produced its first real surprise. The course included 8 stations ranging from physical strength requirements to coordination challenges to one station, Station 5, that was a puzzle component under time pressure. A locked equipment case with a combination mechanism, 4 dials each with 10 positions requiring a correct sequence to open. The case contained a piece of kit that was required to complete Station 6. Candidates had 90 seconds to open it, or they ran Station 6 without the equipment, which made Station 6 significantly harder. The combination was not provided in advance. The information to derive it was embedded in the briefing materials candidates had received the previous evening, a standard operating procedure document, 42 pages full of technical specifications and tactical protocols. The combination was hidden in those pages the way a needle hides in 42 pages of hay referenced obliquely through serial numbers and equipment codes that properly cross-referenced yielded a 4-digit sequence. Most candidates had either not found it, not recognized it, or not retained it. Brixton burned 40 of his 90 seconds on the dials before giving up and running Station 6 without the kit. Torres made it to 30 seconds remaining before abandoning the attempt. Holloway, despite his shoulder, managed it with 11 seconds to spare, which told Ava something significant about his analytical capability and his preparation habits. She had found the sequence in the briefing document at approximately 11:45 the previous night. She had cross-referenced it twice to confirm. She had committed it to memory using a spatial encoding method her father had taught her that linked numbers to physical positions in a mental 3-dimensional space. She opened the case in 14 seconds. 14 seconds out of 90. And she opened it without hesitation, without looking around, without any visible indication that she was doing anything other than the most straightforward task in the world. Just 4 calm movements of her right hand, a click, a lift of the lid, and she was extracting the kit and moving towards Station 6. The cadre member running Station 5 was a young petty officer named Vasquez, who had been with the teams for 3 years and had the particular form of boredom that comes from running the same evaluation station 40 times. He had timed every candidate's case opening attempt with a stopwatch. When Ava walked away from the case at the 14-second mark, he looked down at his stopwatch with an expression that suggested it had personally offended him by displaying that number. He looked up at where she was already moving away. He looked back at the stopwatch. He clicked it off and made a notation on a sheet that was slightly more emphatic than usual, pressing harder on the pen than necessary, the way people do when they're writing down something that surprises them. After the obstacle course, the tactical decision drill. This was the one Graves had designed specifically for this evaluation cycle, and it was the one he had been most interested in running since before the candidates arrived. Because physical performance had floors and ceilings that could be roughly predicted from intake data, height, weight, fitness scores, training history. But tactical decision-making under stress was the variable that no intake data reliably predicted, and it was the variable that, in Graves' experience, separated the candidates who could be trained into operators from the ones who could only ever be trained into athletes. The drill involved a simulated patrol scenario. Candidates moved through a constructed environment, not a building, just a series of marked zones in the open desert, and were presented with a sequence of decision points, each one requiring a choice from two options, with consequences that rippled forward into the next decision point. It was a branching tree of tactical cause and effect. The cadre watched every choice and every timing. Ava moved through the drill at a pace that was not the fastest and not the most hesitant. She paused at 2 of the 8 decision points, not to deliberate, but to collect a specific piece of information that was available in the environment and that most candidates had not noticed was there. At decision point 4, she identified a piece of marker tape on a stake at 45 degrees to the main path that indicated a secondary threat position. Nobody in the group before her had identified the tape. She adjusted her choice at that point accordingly. At decision point 7, she made a choice that was counterintuitive. The conservative option when most candidates had taken the aggressive one, and the reasoning behind it only became clear at decision point 8, where the aggressive choice at 7 resulted in a simulated exposure to a threat that the conservative choice had avoided. When the debrief came, Graves walked the group through every decision tree. He was direct and specific and did not soften his assessments of poor choices. When he reached decision point 4, he asked the group how many of them had identified the secondary marker tape. 2 hands went up. Holloway, Ava. Graves looked at Holloway. What did it tell you? Secondary threat position about 40 meters northeast. Changed my choice at the fork. Good. Graves looked at Ava. The same question, the same flat tone he used for everyone. Secondary threat position, she said, but also confirmation that the primary path was actively monitored, which meant the correct choice at point 5 was also affected, not just point 4. The briefing room was quiet. Graves looked at her for a moment. His face was a wall. Explain. If someone placed that marker at point 4, they were establishing an observation line. That line extended forward to point 5. Taking the primary path at 5 meant crossing that observation line twice. The secondary path at 5 was longer, but it stayed off the line. More quiet. Callahan, standing to the right, had his pen on his clipboard, but wasn't writing. He was just listening. Graves said, "That's a second-order inference from a piece of marker tape." "Yes, sir." "Most trained operators don't make that inference in a live environment, Ed." "I know, sir." A beat. "How do you know that?" "Because nobody else in this group took the secondary path at point 5, and this group includes people with considerably more operational exposure than I have." Something happened in the room. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody gasped. Nobody made a sound. But there was a shift in the quality of the silence, the way a room's acoustics change when something absorbs the sound differently than expected. Kowalski was in the back of the room. His arms were crossed. He was looking at Ava with an expression that had completed its transition from contempt to something more complicated and less comfortable. Graves looked at Ava for 2 full seconds. Then he said, "Candidates dismissed," and the debrief was over. Outside, as the group dispersed, Reyes fell into step beside Ava for the first time. Reyes was not a man who wasted motion or words. He was dark-eyed and economical, and had been watching her for 2 days with the particular attention of someone who is running their own independent assessment. He walked beside her for about 15 steps before he spoke. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he said. She looked at him. "My father." "What did he do?" "Long-range work, but mostly he taught me how to read situations." She paused. "He said the shot was always the last thing, everything before it was the real job." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, a small and genuine movement. "Your father sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," she said. "The was landed without drama, but Reyes heard it and didn't push past it. He just nodded again and the conversation ended there, natural and complete. And he peeled off toward the equipment bay, and she kept walking toward her quarters. Behind both of them, far enough back that neither would notice, Callahan watched Reyes walk away, and then watched Ava walk away, and then took out his phone and typed a short note to himself. He did this occasionally, not formal reports, just observations he didn't want to lose before he had time to process them. The note he typed this time was 3 words. He looked at those 3 words for a moment. Then he put his phone away and went to find Graves. Graves was in the command buildings, standing at a table with the day's assessment sheets spread in front of him, and he was looking at them the way a man looks at something that is telling him something he didn't expect. Callahan came in and stood across the table. "She ID'd the second-order inference," Callahan said. "I was there. In real time, under heat stress, after a weighted run on a full obstacle course." Graves didn't respond. "Jonas." Callahan used his first name, which he did rarely, and only when he was about to say something that mattered. "I've been running evaluations with you for 6 years. How many candidates have made that inference?" At point 5, Graves was quiet. "How many are 2?" Graves said, counting her. "Who was the other one?" Graves looked up from the assessment sheets. His expression was controlled and flat, and underneath it, something was shifting the way the surface of water shifts when pressure changes beneath it. "Me," he said, "when I ran the drill as a candidate, 18 years ago." Callahan didn't say anything. Sometimes the correct response to information was silence, and Callahan was skilled enough to recognize those moments. Graves looked back down at the sheets. He picked up Ava's assessment page. He looked at the numbers and the notations and the decision point data, and he held it in a way that was slightly different from how he'd been holding the other sheets. Not reverently, not dramatically, just with a fraction more attention. "She's been here 2 days, he said, and this time it didn't sound like a deadline. It sounded like a fact he was trying to recalibrate against other facts. Outside the command building, the desert heat had reached 107 degrees and was not finished climbing. Tomorrow's evolution was the sniper range. Graves had planned it as the session most likely to expose the limits of candidates who had been performing above their expected baseline, the discipline most likely to strip away any performance effect and reveal raw capability underneath. He had planned it specifically as the session most likely to reveal Ava Vance's ceiling. He had not yet considered the possibility that the session might reveal something else entirely. In her quarters, Ava cleaned her kit with methodical care and then sat on the edge of her bunk and was still for a long time. She was not resting. She was running the day. Every exchange, every observation, every data point collected and cross-referenced against what she already knew. She was thinking about the sniper range. She had been thinking about it since she arrived. Her father had built her for many things. But this was the one place on this base where every assumption they had carried about her, from the moment she stepped off that transport, would either be confirmed or destroyed. She had spent 11 years preparing for 800 meters. Tomorrow she was going to show Jonas Graves exactly what her father had built. And this time she was not going to be quiet about it. She had not slept much, not because she was afraid, because she was ready. And readiness has its own particular restlessness, the kind that keeps the mind moving even when the body needs stillness. She lay in her bunk until 03:45, and then she stopped pretending and sat up and began her preparation. The sniper range was scheduled for 0800. That gave her 4 hours and 15 minutes. She used every one of them. She went through her pre-shot routine the way her father had drilled it into her since she was 6 years old. Not the physical routine, not yet, but the mental architecture of it. The sequential building of stillness that he called stacking the room. You start with your breathing, then your heartbeat, then the sounds around you, then the temperature on your skin, then the weight of your own body against whatever surface it rests on. You build inward, layer by layer, until what's left at the center is nothing but the calculation. No emotion, no performance, no awareness of being watched, just the variables in the solution. Her father had told her once, lying in a field at 2 in the morning when she was 11 years old, and he was teaching her the difference between a 200-meter shot and an 800-meter shot. The rifle is the last 10% Ava. The first 90% is everything that happens inside your skull before you touch the trigger. Most people spend their whole lives thinking it's the other way around. That's why most people miss. She thought about that now in the dark at 03:45, building the room. By 0700, she was at the range staging area. Nobody else was there yet. The sun was already beginning its work on the desert, and the air had that crystalline early quality clear and sharp, the distortion not yet risen from the sand that would close down within 2 hours as the heat built, and the thermal waves began their interference pattern above the ground. She knew the window. Her father had taught her about desert shooting conditions with the same methodical precision he'd taught her everything else. The morning window was real. The question was whether Graves would run the range during it or after it. She suspected after it, because after it was harder and Graves was building information, and harder conditions built more information than easy ones. She was right. Callahan arrived at 0715, saw her standing at the staging area, and made the same small sound in his throat he'd made on day one when he found her at assembly 11 minutes early. He set up his equipment without speaking to her. But as he worked, he positioned himself slightly closer to her side of the staging area than was strictly necessary for setup efficiency. She noted this without reacting to it. The other candidates arrived between 0730 and 0750. Graves arrived at 0800 exactly from the opposite direction than anyone expected, coming from behind the target line rather than from the staging area, which meant he had been downrange before any of them, checking conditions, measuring distortion, patterns, doing his own preparation with the same obsessive precision he demanded from everyone else. That Ava thought was worth knowing. The Master Chief did not ask of others what he himself had not already done. That was a particular kind of integrity, and it meant his standards were not performances, they were genuine. He walked to the front of the group and looked at them. Sniper range, he said. Each candidate will run a standard qualification sequence. 300 meters, 500, then 800. 5 shots at each distance. Standard target. Wind today is 8 to 12 knots, variable left to right, shifting. Thermal distortion will increase as the morning progresses. He paused. This is not a competition. This is an assessment of fundamentals. Control your breathing. Control your position. Control your mind. The rifle will do the rest if you let it. He looked at the group one more time. Sequence by candidate number. Vance. She looked up. You're last. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second after he said it. Not long enough to be a taunt. Not short enough to be neutral. Exactly the ambiguous duration of a man who has thought about this placement decision more than he intended to. She understood immediately. Last meant she would watch every other candidate shoot first. Last meant maximum heat distortion, maximum wind variability, maximum accumulated pressure of a morning's worth of observation. Mate was the hardest position on the range. He knew she'd understand that. He had placed her there deliberately. What she couldn't know yet was whether it was deliberate to expose her or deliberate to see what she did with the hardest position. She thought about it for half a second and decided it didn't matter. The position was the position. She'd shoot it regardless. Yes, sir, she said. The sequence began. Brixton went first. He was a capable shooter, controlled patient, technically sound at 300 and 500. At 800, his grouping opened up, the wind catching 2 of his 5 shots and pulling them outside the scoring zone. 3 out of 5 at 800. The cadre noted it without visible reaction. 3 out of 5 at 800 under these conditions was a respectable result for a candidate at his level. Torres shot next. He was better at 300 than at 500, which suggested his fundamentals were strong, but his wind reading was underdeveloped. At 800, he managed 2 out of 5. He came off the line looking controlled, but the set of his jaw said he knew it wasn't enough. Holloway shot with his shoulder. She could see it from the staging area, the way he adjusted his position at each distance, compensating for the joint issue with body geometry. It was remarkable, actually, that he was compensating as effectively as he was. He hit 4 out of 5 at 300, 3 at 500, and 2 at 800. The shoulder was costing him at distance, where the positional compensation introduced micro tremors at the moment of trigger break. He came off the line and didn't look at anyone. Candidate by candidate, the morning moved forward. The temperature climbed. By the time the group was halfway through the sequence, the thermal shimmer above the sand had begun the visual interference that made 800-meter targets dance and blur at the edges, that turned a clean sight picture into a probability problem. Each successive candidate was shooting into progressively harder conditions. Kowalski shot near the end of the sequence. He was a good shot, not exceptional, but good, the product of years of training and operational experience that had built a competence that was real and reliable. 4 out of 5 at 300, 4 out of 5 at 500. He took his time at 800 longer than any other candidate, settling into his position with the deliberate care of a man who knows exactly where his limits are and is working right at the edge of them. 3 out of 5 at 800. He came off the line and looked at the cadre board and then looked at Ava with an expression she'd never seen from him before. It wasn't contempt. It wasn't the laughing dismissal from day one. It was something closer to a challenge, the look of a man who has just set a mark and is daring you to beat it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, not backing down, just done with the exchange, and began her final mental preparation. "Vance," Callahan said, "you're up." She walked to the firing line. The heat at this point was 103 degrees. The wind had shifted to its most variable pattern of the morning cycling between 8 and 14 knots, with direction changes that had no predictable interval. The thermal distortion above the 800-meter target zone was significant, a constant rolling shimmer that made precise range estimation a dynamic calculation rather than a fixed one. Every other candidate had already shot. Every one of them was watching. She settled into her position, went through the first 3 stages of the stacking routine: breathing, heartbeat, external sounds receding. She felt the rifle's weight and found the natural point of aim and made 2 small adjustments to her position that corrected a slight mismatch between her body's natural geometry and the firing line's orientation. Her father had told her, "Never fight your position, find your position and then find the rifle's home within it. The rifle knows where it wants to be. Your job is to listen." 300 meters, 5 shots. She fired them in a controlled rhythm, not rushed, not drawn out. Each shot separated by exactly the breathing cycle her father had drilled into her until it was as automatic as walking. The target was retrieved electronically after her 5th shot. 5 for 5, all within the central scoring zone. The grouping was tight enough that from the staging area where several of the men had gathered to watch, it was difficult to count the individual holes without magnification. Vasquez, running the target system, looked at his monitor and said nothing. But he glanced at Callahan, and Callahan gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. 500 meters. She repositioned with one small adjustment. Her left elbow moved approximately 2 centimeters forward to account for the angle change. She read the wind for 4 seconds, calculating the current shift pattern, estimating where the next cycle would take it, choosing her timing window. She fired her first shot between wind cycles. Hit, adjusted for what the wind did with the subsequent shift. Hit. By shot 3, she had the wind's pattern internalized, and the last 2 shots went exactly where the calculation placed them. 5 for 5. Behind her at the staging area, no one was speaking anymore. Kowalski had his arms uncrossed now. They hung at his sides, which for him was a significant postural shift. He crossed his arms the way some men put on armor, and he had been wearing that armor since day one. Decker stood next to him with his mouth slightly open in a way that he was probably not aware of. Reyes stood apart from both of them, watching with an intensity that was entirely different from theirs. Not surprise, but confirmation. The look of someone who had suspected something and is now watching it be proven. 800 meters. Ava looked at the target for a long moment before she touched the rifle. At 800 meters, the thermal distortion was substantial. The target, at that distance, appeared to pulse gently in the shimmer, its edges softening and sharpening in a rhythm that corresponded to the heatwave cycles. The wind at this distance was a completely different problem than at 500. The bullet's flight time was long enough that the wind could shift twice between muzzle and target, which meant reading the current wind was only partially useful. You had to read the wind's pattern project where it would be during the bullet's flight and aim for where the wind was going to be, not where it was. Her father had spent 6 months teaching her this when she was 13. 6 months of misses and recalculations and corrections and understanding until the wind's behavior in her mind was less like a force and more like a language she had learned to read. She set up her position, went all the way into the room, found the stillness at the center. First shot. She knew before the target reported it. She could feel it in the trigger brake and the recoil's quality, in something beyond mechanical that her father called the knowing. The fraction of a second before confirmation, when the calculation and the execution have aligned perfectly, and the body understands the result before the information arrives. Hit. The monitor confirmed it, center zone. Graves, who had been standing slightly apart from the group, took one step forward. It was the first physical movement he'd made since she started shooting. One step. He stopped himself there, but he'd moved. Second shot. She adjusted for a wind shift she'd read 2 seconds in advance. Hit. Third shot. The wind cycled hard to a gust 14 knots, the highest of the morning. She waited. 4 seconds. The gust passed. She fired in the trailing edge of it. Hit. Behind her, the silence was absolute. The kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that you can feel pressing against your eardrums from the inside. Fourth shot. The thermal distortion peaked the target, almost disappearing into the shimmer for a full 3 seconds, and she held not from patience exactly, but from the pure mechanical understanding that the distortion was atmospheric and would cycle, and that firing into the peak distortion was a choice made from impatience, not skill. She waited for the cycle to clear. Hit. 1 shot remaining. She became aware in the very back of her processing, the outermost edge of the room, the place she kept peripheral awareness, that something had changed in the way the men behind her were holding themselves. The quality of their stillness had shifted. They weren't watching an evaluation anymore. They were watching something they didn't have a category for. In the absence of a category was creating a particular kind of suspended, breath-held attention that she had never experienced being directed at her before. She did not let it in. She kept it at the edge of the room where peripheral awareness lives, and she stayed at the center where the calculation lives, and she took her last breath and let it halfway out and went completely still. She fired. The recoil, the knowing, the 400 millisecond flight time that felt outside of normal time entirely. Hit 5 for 5 at 800 meters. She came off the firing line and stood up, and the world came back in the heat, the sound of the desert, the weight of the rifle in her hands, and she turned and found herself facing a wall of silence that was the most complete and unexpected silence she had ever stood inside of. Nobody spoke. Not Kowalski, not Decker, not any of the 12 candidates or 4 cadre members standing at the staging area. And then Graves did something. He walked to the firing line. He stood exactly where she had been standing. He looked downrange at the 800-meter target still visible in the electronic display, her 5 shots clustered in a grouping that would have been remarkable at 300 meters, and he looked at it for a full 5 seconds. Then he turned and looked at her. "Request," he said, her voice was steady. "Sir." "Where did you learn to read wind like that?" She held his gaze. "My father, he used to say the wind is the last argument between you and the target. If you've done everything else right, the wind is the only conversation left to have." Graves was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of adjustment, the way a lens adjusts when the focus ring finds the correct setting. "Your father trained military long-range work," she said. "Yes, sir." "What branch?" "He didn't talk about that." "A beat." "Fair enough." He looked at her for one more second. Then he looked at Callahan. "Record the groupings and flag the 800 sequence for the evaluation summary." Callahan said, "Already done, sir." Graves nodded once and turned and walked toward the command building, and the group watched him go, and nobody said anything for a moment after he disappeared through the door. And then Kowalski said something that nobody expected. He said, "Show me how you read the wind cycle." He said it to Ava, directly, without the armor of mockery, without the distance of contempt. He said it the way a craftsman asks another craftsman about a technique, direct without ego, because the ego had been outweighed by the genuine desire to understand something real. Ava looked at him. She studied his face for a moment, looking for the trap. There wasn't one. His expression was as stripped down and direct as his question. "Stand here," she said, and she walked him to a position on the firing line. "Watch the sand surface at about 300 meters. Don't look at the target. Watch the sand." Kowalski looked at the sand. "See the way the surface grain pattern shifts? That's the leading edge of a cycle. It'll move toward us over about 4 seconds. Then it'll cross the line and hit the target zone at about the 7-second mark. If you fire at the leading edge right when you see the grain shift, your bullet arrives in the trailing column." Kowalski stared at the sand. He stared at it for a long time. Then slowly he said, "I can see it." "Now you can," Ava said. There was a pause. Several of the other candidates had drifted closer, listening. Reyes was directly behind her left shoulder. Torres had come forward. Even Holloway's shoulder and all had moved to where he could hear. Kowalski looked at her. The wall that had been between them since the moment she stepped off the transport, that wall built from assumption and institutional pride, and the kind of ego that comes from years of being excellent at something and not being challenged at it, was not gone. It was cracked. And through the crack, something else was coming through. Not respect yet. Something earlier than respect. The precursor to it, recognition. He recognized what he was looking at. And the thing about Kowalski, the thing that made him underneath all the noise actually worth his position in this unit, was that when he recognized something real, he didn't fight it. He just looked at it. Okay, he said, just that, one word, but in the context of everything that had preceded it across 2.5 days of dismissal and laughter, and boots near her pack, and contempt, delivered at full volume, that single word was a seismic event. Decker heard it. He looked at Kowalski with an expression of slight disorientation. The way you look when someone you thought you knew does something you genuinely didn't predict. Reyes heard it. He didn't react visibly, but something settled in his posture, a slight release like a held breath. Let go. Torres heard it and looked at Ava with something that was uncomplicated and direct. It was admiration. He didn't try to hide it. Ava heard it. She filed it where it belonged, not in the victory column, not yet, because one word from one man on one morning was not the same as what she'd come here to build, but in the column marked real data, and she moved forward. She looked downrange one more time. The 800-meter target was still visible in the display monitor, her 5 shots arranged in their tight cluster at the center. She looked at it the way you look at a piece of work you've done correctly, not with pride, not with relief, but with the clean satisfaction of a calculation that came out right. Then she picked up her kit and prepared for the rest of the day. Because the range had been one thing, one morning, one sequence of shots under controlled conditions with a known distance and a measurable target. What came next was going to be different. What came next was going to test something the rifle couldn't solve for her. What came next was Graves, not the Graves who ran evaluations and held clipboards and delivered flat-voiced assessments, but the Graves who had just watched something he wasn't prepared for and had gone into the command building to figure out what to do about it. The Graves who had moved one step forward on the firing line before stopping himself. The Graves who had asked her about her father's words with something in his voice that was almost not quite, but almost the sound of a man encountering something he respects before he's ready to admit it. That Graves was thinking, recalculating. And when Jonas Graves recalculated, Ava understood the next thing he designed was always harder than anything that came before. She was ready for harder. She had been ready for harder since the moment she stepped off that transport and heard his men laughing. The afternoon was coming. The desert had more to say, and she intended to listen to every word of it. Graves was in the command building for 47 minutes. Callahan knew because he timed it. Not deliberately, he just noticed when Graves went in, and he noticed when Graves came out, and the duration registered because 47 minutes was unusual. Graves was not a man who disappeared into buildings to think. He thought while moving, while doing, while running evaluations and driving parallel tracks and glassing candidates through binoculars. Static thinking was not his pattern. 47 minutes of static thinking meant something significant was being restructured. When he came out, he had a single sheet of paper in his hand, and his expression was the most neutral it had been all week, which in Graves' case meant the opposite of neutral. It meant he had made a decision and locked his face down around it so nothing leaked before he was ready. He found Callahan at the equipment staging area and handed him the sheet without preamble. Callahan read it. He read it again. Then he looked up. You're adding the 1,200-meter evolution. Yes. That's not in the standard evaluation protocol. No. The 1,200-meter moving target under current heat conditions is outside standard training parameters. I'm aware of that. Callahan looked at the sheet one more time. The 1,200-meter evolution was something the cadre had used exactly twice in the history of this program, both times with candidates who had already demonstrated elite-tier performance on standard sequences and needed a further differentiator. It was not a test designed for candidates. It was a test designed for operators, for people who had already proven they belonged and needed to prove how far above belonging they were. She's 17, Callahan said. I know how old she is. You're going to put a 17-year-old on a 1,200-meter moving target in 105-degree heat after a full morning of range work. Graves looked at him with that flat, unreadable expression that meant the decision was made and the conversation was advisory only. I'm going to offer it, he said. She can decline. Callahan held his gaze for a moment. She won't decline. No, Graves said quietly. She won't. He took the sheet back and walked toward the range. Callahan watched him go and stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and thought about several things at once. Then he went to find the rest of the cadre because if Graves was running the 1200-meter evolution this afternoon, everyone needed to be positioned correctly. The afternoon session assembled at 1300 hours. The sun was at its peak efficiency, not the highest point in the sky, but the angle at which it combined with reflected ground heat most effectively to produce the worst possible visual conditions for precision work. The candidates had eaten, hydrated, and rested through the noon hour, and they came to the afternoon assembly looking better than they'd looked at the end of the morning, recovered but not fully. The accumulated fatigue of 3 days sitting in their muscles like sediment. Graves stood in front of the group. "This afternoon's evolution is not in your briefing materials," he said. "It was not planned as part of the standard sequence. I am adding it based on this morning's range performance." He paused, and the pause had a different quality than his usual pauses. It was weighted, deliberate, the kind that makes people straighten their spines involuntarily. "One candidate will be offered the opportunity to attempt the 1200-meter moving target evolution." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The desert wind moved through the staging area and made no sound. "Vance," Graves said. She was standing at the right end of the candidate line. She didn't step forward. She just looked at him. "The evolution is voluntary," he said. "You can decline without consequence to your evaluation record. The morning's performance stands regardless of your choice." She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. "I won't decline, sir." Something flickered in Graves' expression. It was not surprise. It was more like the confirmation of a calculation, the click of a predicted outcome arriving on schedule. "Then we moved to the 1200-meter line in 20 minutes. Hydrate." He turned and walked away, and behind him among the candidates, something broke open. Holloway said it first low and directed at no one specific. 1200 meters, moving target. "That's not evaluation protocol," Torres said. "That's operational certification. I've never even heard of that being run in a training context." Reyes said nothing. He was looking at Ava. Kowalski turned to her directly. His voice was different than it had been at any point in the previous 3 days. Flat, serious. The voice of someone communicating without any of the social padding. "You understand what you're walking into?" It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes." Moving target at 1200 changes everything. The wind problem doubles. The bullet flight time is over a second. The target is never where it appears to be. "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "Your father teach you 1200-meter work." She met his eyes. "He taught me everything." Kowalski held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, and completely without condescension. He turned away and found something to look at on the horizon. Decker started to say something. Kowalski said, "Don't," without looking at him. Decker didn't. The 20 minutes passed faster than 20 minutes should have. At the 1200-meter line, the setup was different from the morning's range. A single firing position, a moving target system that traversed a lateral track at variable speed, in a wind condition that had shifted through the afternoon into something genuinely complex, gusting between 12 and 18 knots, with a cross component that added a vertical element to the horizontal drift calculation. The entire unit cadre candidates Graves stood behind the firing position in a loose arc. Not crowded, not dramatic, just present. Everyone there. Callahan had his clipboard but wasn't looking at it. Ava knelt at the firing position and went through her setup with the same methodical economy she'd used all morning. She checked her position geometry, checked her natural point of aim, made one adjustment, a small rotation of her entire body 2 degrees clockwise to square her natural point of aim with the target track rather than the target's current position. Graves watched this adjustment. He watched it the way a man watches something that tells him exactly what he needs to know about a person's level of understanding. Most shooters had aimed at where the target was. She had just aligned herself with where the target was going to be. That distinction was the entire difference between a trained shooter and a sniper. He said nothing. She began her wind reading. 1200 meters required reading 3 distinct wind zones: the area near the muzzle, the mid-range zone where the bullet transitioned from powered flight to ballistic arc, and the target zone. Each zone had its own characteristics this afternoon. She read them in sequence, building the calculation layer by layer, the way her father had taught her to build the room from the outside in, until only the solution remained at the center. The target began its traverse. "Target is live," Callahan said. She watched it for 2 full traverses without firing. Just watched. Tracking the speed pattern, looking for the variable whether the traverse was perfectly constant or had micro-accelerations and decelerations built in. Her father had told her mechanical systems have personalities. Find the personality before you engage it. She found it on the second traverse. A slight hesitation at the left end of the track, a fraction of a second before the return movement. The motor governing the traverse had a small irregularity on the reversal. It repeated exactly on the second traverse. She filed it. Behind her, someone shifted their weight. The sound of a boot on dry ground. Then stillness again. She fired her first shot on the third traverse. She did not aim at the target's current position. She did not aim at where it would be when the bullet arrived based on constant speed. She aimed at a point that accounted for the constant speed, the wind in all 3 zones, the bullet's arc at 1,200 meters, and the slight hesitation irregularity in the target's motor that would place the target in a fractionally different position than pure calculation predicted. The bullet's flight time at 1,200 meters was approximately 1.3 seconds. 1.3 seconds is a very long time to be right about everything. Hit. The confirmation came through the target system monitor, and Vasquez, who had not made a sound all morning without cause, made a sound now, not a word, just a sound, low involuntary, the kind that escapes before the professional filter catches it. Graves took a breath. His chest visibly rose and fell, which was the most physical expression of anything he had shown in 3 days. He stood very still. Second shot. She recalculated for a wind shift she had predicted 2 seconds before it arrived. She'd seen the precursor in the near-zone sand pattern, the same leading edge she'd shown Kowalski that morning. She fired into the predicted window. Hit. Behind her, Kowalski said something very quiet under his breath. It was a single word. It was not suitable for polite company. He said it the way men say things when the reality in front of them has exceeded the category they put it in, and they need to express that exceedance somehow. Decker heard it and looked at Kowalski, and for once had absolutely nothing to add. Third shot. The wind cycled to its maximum gust, 18 knots, the hardest of the afternoon. She held, counted, felt the gust peak and begin its decay, and fired at the precise moment the decay crossed through 12 knots on its way down, which was the point at which the gust's interference pattern was most predictable. Hit. Graves stepped forward again. 2 steps this time. He stopped himself again, but 2 steps, and the second step had been unconscious. She could tell from the way he stilled himself after it, like a man catching himself doing something he hadn't decided to do. 3 for 3 at 1,200 meters. Moving target, maximum heat distortion, variable crosswind. And then the evolution entered territory that nobody in the staging area had prepared themselves for. The target system malfunctioned. Not catastrophically, it didn't stop. It accelerated. The traverse speed jumped from its calibrated setting to approximately double, which destroyed every calculation she had built about the target's movement pattern. The hesitation irregularity she'd found was now occurring at a different interval. The window she'd been using was gone. She had 1.3 seconds of bullet flight time against a target moving at twice the speed she'd prepared for in maximum wind conditions. At 1,200 meters, Callahan said, "Standby system error." Hold, Graves said immediately. Miley. Vance, stand down. System malfunction. We'll reset. She didn't move. Vance, Graves said again, sharper. "Sir," she said. Her voice was completely level. "I have it." A beat of silence that was very different from all the previous silences. This one had something electric in it. "The malfunction is not random," she said, not moving from her position, still tracking the target through her scope. "The acceleration is consistent. It's running at double speed, but the motor irregularity is still present. It's just occurring at half the interval. I have a new firing solution." Nobody spoke. Graves stood absolutely still. He was doing his own calculation, not a shooting calculation, a decision calculation. The question of whether to shut this down for safety, protocol reasons, or let her attempt something that had no precedent in any evaluation he had ever run. He made his decision in 4 seconds. "Your call," he said. "Take it or stand down. Either is acceptable." She tracked the target for one more traverse at the new speed, confirmed the irregularity interval, built the new solution. "Taking it," she said. 4th shot. The bullet was in the air for 1.3 seconds, crossing 1,200 meters of heated desert air, in complex crosswind conditions toward a target moving at double its calibrated speed. Hit. The sound that came from behind her was not controlled. Several voices simultaneously. Not cheers, exactly. These were not men who cheered easily, but something released some pressure valve of disbelief that couldn't hold anymore, and it came out as a collective exhale that was half sound and half pure involuntary reaction. Kowalski said out loud to no one and everyone, "That is not possible." Reyes quietly immediately, "You just watched it happen." "I know what I watched. I'm saying it shouldn't be possible." "She found the motor irregularity," Reyes said. "She adjusted her solution in real time for a malfunctioning system at 1,200 meters. In this wind. In this heat." He paused. She didn't miss. Kowalski had no response to that. For the first time since Ava had arrived on this base, Kowalski had nothing to say. One shot remaining. She took it. She built the solution from scratch one more time, not relying on the previous calculations, starting fresh. Because each shot at this distance in these conditions was its own complete problem, and carrying assumptions forward was how you missed. Her father's voice in her head, clear as it had ever been. Every shot is the first shot. Treat it like you've never fired before and you know everything. Fifth shot. Hit. 5 for 5. On a malfunctioning system. At 1,200 meters. She came off the firing position and stood up and turned around, and she found herself looking at a group of men who looked fundamentally different than they had 3 days ago. Not just the candidates, the cadre, Vasquez, Callahan, every person in the arc behind the firing line. They were looking at her the way people look at something they don't have adequate language for. Graves was standing 8 feet from her, 2 steps closer than his starting position, both steps unconscious, and he'd stopped trying to take them back. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the entire accumulated weight of 3 days, the dismissal, the contempt, the laughter, the deliberate isolation, his 3-day deadline, all of it was in the space between them. He said, "How did you find the malfunction interval that fast?" "The leading edge of each traverse had a micropause," she said. "It's what I look for in any mechanical system. The personality of the mechanism. When the speed doubled, the pause halved. The math was the same." Graves was quiet. "My father told me," she continued, and her voice was steady and direct, but not cold. There was something in it that was almost gentle, the way you are gentle with something that matters. "That the most dangerous assumption in precision work is that the problem will behave the way you prepared for it. The real work is what you do when it doesn't." Graves looked at her for a long moment. Something was happening in his expression. Not a collapse, not a dramatic reversal, nothing theatrical. Just a quiet internal revision. The kind that happens when a man who has been building a wall realizes the wall is no longer serving the function he built it for. "Where is your father's now?" he asked. He kept his voice flat, but the question itself was not a flat question. It was a personal question, and coming from Graves in front of the entire unit, it was significant. She held his gaze. "He died 8 months ago," she said. "Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end." The desert wind moved through the staging area. Nobody spoke. Graves held her eyes for a full 4 seconds. Then he nodded once, small, genuine, and said, "I'm sorry." 2 words. From Jonas Graves, who did not offer personal words in professional context. 2 words that cost him something. She received them without performance. "Thank you, sir." He looked at the target monitor one more time. 5 holes in the target at 1,200 meters. Moving target, malfunctioning system. Worst conditions of the day. He looked at it the way you look at a thing that has required you to update something you were certain about. Then he turned to Callahan. "Document the full sequence. All distances, all conditions, system malfunction included. Flag it for the program coordinator." "Yes, sir." Callahan wrote on his clipboard, but he was writing the way people write when their hands are operating on muscle memory and their mind is somewhere else. He was somewhere else. He was back in the conversation from 2 nights ago, the one where he'd asked Graves how many candidates had made the second-order inference at decision point 5, and Graves had said 2 counting her, and the other one was himself 18 years ago. He was thinking about what it meant that a 17-year-old girl who had been dismissed as a political experiment was now standing in the desert, having done something that would be discussed in this program for years. He wrote on his clipboard and said nothing. The candidates dispersed slowly with none of the usual end-of-session energy. They moved the way people move after witnessing something that requires processing a little quieter, a little more internal, carrying something new in their heads that they didn't know what to do with yet. Torres fell into step beside Ava on the walk back to staging. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your father, the way you talk about what he taught you, it sounds like more than training." She considered the question honestly. "It was his way of staying," she said. "He knew he wasn't going to my there, so he put everything he knew into me and hoped it would be enough to carry me through whatever came next." Torres was quiet for a moment. Is it enough? She looked at the desert ahead of them, the heat shimmer still rising from the sand, the sky enormous and clear and utterly indifferent. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me when we're done." Torres nodded. He didn't push further. He just walked beside her with the quiet respect of a man who understands that some things don't require a response beyond presence. Behind them, both Kowalski walked alone. He had not spoken since Reyes had said, "You just watched it happen." He was working through something privately, and the working through was visible in the set of his shoulders, not the defensive armor crossing of the first 2 days, but a more open, less comfortable posture. The posture of a man who is genuinely rethinking something he thought was settled. He had been wrong about her. He knew it. The knowing was not pleasant, but Kowalski was underneath the noise, a man whose deepest identity was built around not lying to himself about operational realities. You couldn't survive what he'd survived by pretending the situation was different from what it was. And the situation right now was clear. He had been wrong. She had been right, and those two facts needed to be dealt with honestly. He would deal with them. He just needed a little more time. Graves walked back to the command building alone. He did not take the clipboard. He did not take any assessment materials. He just walked, hands at his sides, and anyone watching him from a distance would have seen a man moving with his usual economy and purpose, but anyone close enough to see his face would have noticed something quieter than usual, something that was doing its work below the surface. He went into the command building and sat at the table and did not spread any papers in front of him. He just sat. And in the silence of that room, with the desert heat pressing against the walls and the distant sounds of the unit moving through end-of-day procedures, he let himself do something he rarely allowed in professional contexts. He let himself be surprised, not destabilized, not uncertain about his position or his authority or his judgment in any broad sense. Just surprised. The specific, precise surprise of a man whose pattern recognition, built over decades and tested in conditions that most people never encountered, had encountered a pattern it didn't have a template for. Ava Vance was not a template he had. She was not the talented young recruit who burned bright and collapsed under sustained pressure. She was not the political experiment that performed in artificial conditions and fell apart in real ones. She was not the exceptional athlete who peaked at physical demands and revealed thin tactical foundations. She was not any of the categories his experience had built, because his experience had been built from a particular pipeline with particular inputs, and she was not from that pipeline. She was from something else, something her father had built in the desert of a different kind over 17 years, with a precision and intentionality that Graves was only now beginning to appreciate the full scope of. He thought about what she'd said. The most dangerous assumption in precision work is that the problem will behave the way you prepared for it. The real work is what you do when it doesn't. He had spent 3 days preparing for Ava Vance to behave the way his experience predicted she would. She had not behaved that way. The real work then was what he did now. He reached across the table and picked up a blank assessment form. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and began to write. And what he wrote was not the 3-day dismissal he had carried into this evaluation. What he wrote was something different, something that had been built by 47 minutes of thinking and an afternoon at the 1,200-meter line, and 2 words he had said to a 17-year-old girl about her dead father. Outside, the desert was beginning its evening transition, the heat starting its slow withdrawal, the light going gold and long across the sand. Tomorrow was day 4, the kill house simulation, the endurance march, the final evolution of a program that had never in its history produced an outcome quite like the one that was now building in the Mojave, like a weather system, quiet and enormous and impossible to stop. Graves wrote. The pen moved across the assessment form with the same deliberate precision he brought to everything. And for the first time since Ava Vance had stepped off that transport, the form did not begin with the word liability. Day 4 began with silence. Not the institutional silence of a base running on schedule, the silence of a place that was holding its breath. Ova felt it when she walked to assembly at 0500. The air had a different quality. The men moved differently. Even the cadre had something adjusted in them, some barely perceptible recalibration in how they stood and where they looked. 3 days had done something to this base, and everyone on it knew it, even the ones who hadn't finished processing it yet. Graves was already at assembly when she arrived. He was standing with Callahan speaking in low tones, and when he heard her footsteps, he didn't turn. Immediately, he finished his sentence to Callahan first, which was professional discipline. But when he did turn, he looked at her for a fraction of a second longer than his established pattern. Not much longer, but she measured fractions. Something had shifted in him overnight. She could see it in the economy of his posture, the way a man carries himself differently when he stopped fighting a conclusion and started operating from it instead. The other candidates arrived. Kowalski came in without looking at the board, without the territorial performance of the first 2 days. He came in and found his position and stood there with a quality of attention that was different, focused inward, like a man who had spent the night doing honest accounting and arrived at a number he needed to sit with. Reyes arrived and immediately positioned himself 2 spots down from Ava, on the line close enough for conversation if conversation was warranted. It was the first time in 4 days he had chosen his position relative to hers rather than independently of her. Graves addressed the group at exactly 0500. Today is the Kill House simulation and the endurance march, he said, in that order. The Kill House runs in unit configuration. You will operate as a single element, not as individual candidates. Every decision made inside that structure is a collective decision. Every failure is a collective failure. He paused. I want you to understand what that means before we start. It does not mean consensus. It does not mean democracy. It means situational awareness distributed across every operator in the element, feeding into the best available decision at the moment the decision is required. If someone in your element has better information than you, that information should drive the call. Rank does not determine accuracy. Reality does. Another pause weighted differently than his usual ones. Move to the kill house in 10 minutes. Kid up. He walked away, and Ava stood for a moment with those words sitting in her chest. Rank does not determine accuracy, reality does, and understood that Graves had just told the entire unit something that was directly about what she had demonstrated the day before without ever saying her name. He had taken what the 1200-meter evolution had proven and translated it into operational doctrine. He had given the unit permission to receive what she had to offer. That was not a small thing from Jonas Graves. That was enormous. Kowalski heard it. She could see it in the way he stood after Graves finished speaking, a small but complete shift in his posture. His chin came up slightly, his shoulders settled back. The posture of a man who has just been given institutional permission to do something he had already decided privately to do. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke, but something passed between them that was the conclusion of a 4-day negotiation that had never used words. The kill house was a constructed structure, multiple rooms, multiple entry points, multiple threat and non-threat targets placed inside to create a complex decision environment. The element would clear it as a unit, each candidate holding a position in the stack decisions made in real time with incomplete information and time pressure. Callahan briefed the configuration outside the structure. Entry point, expected room layout, known variables and unknown variables. The unknown variables were the point. You never knew exactly what was inside. You went in with a plan and you adapted when the plan met reality. Element lead was Callahan said, is Brixton for this run. Vance your tail end Charlie. Tail end Charlie, last in the stack, the position with the worst sightlines and the most responsibility for rear security. Another deliberate placement, not by Graves this time, by the evaluation design itself. Last in the stack meant she would have the least direct information about what was happening at the front and would need to process and communicate through the most noise. Brixton organized the stack with the confidence of a man comfortable in this role. He was good at it, decisive, clear, physically capable of making the entry fast and hard. The stack organized behind him, and Ava took her position at the rear, and felt the weight of the element in front of her. 7 people between her and the entry point. 7 sets of decisions she couldn't fully control, but needed to be synchronized with. Moving, Brixton said. They moved. The first room was the free room, no threats, 2 non-threats of furniture configuration that required the element to adjust their spacing. Brixton called it correctly, and they moved through clean. The second room had a single threat target in the far right corner and a non-threat directly in front of the entry. Brixton's call was fast and accurate. 2 candidates secured the room and the element pushed to the third. The third room was where the simulation built its real test. Ava was still in the corridor when she saw it. She was tail end Charlie, which meant she was the last one through the second room's rear exit, which meant she had a sightline angle into the third room's entry that no one else in the element had. And from that angle, in the 2 seconds she had before her position in the stack required her to move, she saw something on the floor just inside the third room's threshold that everyone in front of her was about to step over. A wire, low, nearly invisible, crossing the threshold at ankle height. Attached to the left door frame at one end, the other end disappeared under a table to the right. Threat indicator. In the kill house simulation, a wire like that meant a triggered device. Step on it. Simulation failure, element killed. Stop, she said. Not loud, not panicked, controlled and immediate and absolutely certain. The element froze. Wire, she said. Threshold, left door frame, ankle height. Brixton, at the front of the element, could not see it from his position. He was stacked against the right side of the door frame, the correct tactical position that happened to be on the wrong side to see what she was seeing. A beat of silence. And then the thing happened that Graves had warned about, and that the simulation was designed to test the hierarchy question. Brixton was element lead. Ava was tail end Charlie, last in the stack, the candidate who had been dismissed as a liability 3 days ago, and she was calling a halt to the element's movement based on information nobody else in the element could independently verify. Did you follow rank or did you follow reality? Brixton held his position for 2 full seconds. 2 seconds is a very long time inside a kill house. Then he said without turning, "Vance, you're certain?" "Yes, 1 more second." Then element holds. Vance talked me through the wire. She described the wire's position, its attachment points, the angle of the connected end under the table. Brixton listened with the specific quality of attention of a man subordinating his ego to operational necessity in real time. And that was not easy, and it was not nothing, and she registered it as significant. "Alternate entry," Brixton called. "Back corridor, right flank, element on me." They moved. They used the alternate entry. They cleared the third room without triggering the wire. They cleared rooms 4 and 5 without incident. They came out the other side of the kill house clean. Element intact, simulation complete, no failures. Callahan was waiting outside with his clipboard. He looked at the element as they came out, reading them, the way he always read people, quickly, completely noting the small physical signs that told him more than debrief reports did. His eyes moved down the line and found Ava and stayed there for a moment, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man adding a column of numbers and finding that the total is larger than he expected and has been correct all along. He looked at Brixton. "How did the element manage the wire threat?" Brixton didn't hesitate. "Tail end Charlie called it," he said. "I couldn't see it from the lead position. She had the angle. She was right." He paused, and the pause had a directness in it that cost him something and was more valuable because of that cost. "I followed her call," Callahan wrote on his clipboard. "Good decision," he said simply. Graves was standing 20 feet back, apart from the group, and he had watched the entire debrief with his arms at his sides and his face at its most controlled. But he had been there. He had watched Brixton say, "I followed her call," with the same directness as he brought to everything. And he had watched Callahan write it down, and he had stood there in the desert morning with 4 days of information and one decision hardening in him like concrete finding its set. He said nothing yet. He would say it when it was time. The element dispersed for a 90-minute break before the endurance march, and during that break, something happened that had no official place in the evaluation program and no line on any assessment form. Kowalski found Ava, not at the staging area, not at the equipment bay, at the water station at the edge of the compound where she had gone alone to hydrate and run the morning through her internal system. He came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment he just stood there as if he was deciding whether to continue or turn around. He continued. He filled his own water bottle and stood beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment. The desert around them was heating up for the day, the air beginning its familiar transition from sharp morning clarity toward the thick pressing weight of midday. Then Kowalski said, "I want to say something." She looked at him. "I was wrong about you." He said it straight. No preamble, no softening, no construction around it to make it easier. Just the fact of it, direct and unadorned. From the first minute you stepped off that transport, I had decided before I saw you, before you did anything. I had already decided. He paused. That's not how I operate. That's not who I am as an operator. And I operated that way with you, and I was wrong. She looked at him for a moment. His jaw was set and his eyes were direct, and the discomfort he was in was real. This was not a comfortable man doing this. This was a disciplined man doing a difficult thing because he had determined it needed to be done. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to hear it from me directly instead of finding out through how I act differently going forward," he said. "You've been working for 4 days in an environment where everyone handed you an extra 10 pounds to carry before you even started. You didn't complain. You didn't make it about that. You just did the work." He paused again. "Your father raised someone worth knowing." The sentence landed with unexpected weight. She felt it move through her chest in a way she hadn't prepared for. Not pain exactly, but the particular pressure of something true arriving in a form you didn't expect. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He would have liked you, the real version of you, the one that's talking right now." Kowalski made a sound that was close to a laugh but wasn't quite. "Yeah," he said. "This version doesn't show up until I've been wrong about something important. Most people's best version doesn't," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded, and the nod was the same one she'd seen on day 3 at the firing line, slow, deliberate, real. He picked up his water bottle and walked away, and she watched him go and stood there in the desert heat with something settled in her that had been unsettled for 4 days. The endurance march began at 1100 hours. 20 kilometers, full kit, 65-pound pack, desert terrain flat, sand rock elevation change at kilometer 12 that added a sustained climb to an already demanding load. The temperature at start was 102 degrees and climbing. Graves briefed it, standing in front of the element with the same flat directness he brought to every evolution. "This is not a race. This is a test of sustained operational capacity under compounding stress. You will all start together. You will all finish together, or the element has failed the evolution. No individual completes this march. The element completes this march." He looked across the group. "That is not a statement about pace. It is a statement about what this program evaluates. Move." They moved. The first 4 kilometers were managed. The group stayed cohesive, pace controlled, nobody reaching their ceiling yet. The desert did its work quietly and thoroughly, the heat pressing down the pack, weight accumulating in the shoulders and hips, with the slow insistence of gravity that never relents. By kilometer 6, the element had begun to stretch slightly at the edges. The natural consequence of 12 individuals with different physical profiles being asked to maintain the same pace under the same load. Ava ran the math on her hip flexor at kilometer 4 and found the answer she'd been hoping not to find. The previous 3 days had accumulated in the tissue in a way that the morning's activity had now pushed past the manageable threshold into something more active. Not injury, not the sharp, sudden signal of structural damage. The sustained, deep, radiating signal of overloaded soft tissue that had been asked to keep performing past the point where rest was the medically correct prescription. She did not slow down. She did what her father had taught her to do with pain that could not be stopped. She classified it, localized it, drew a mental boundary around it, and treated it as data rather than emergency. It was there. It was real. It was not going to stop her. She moved the awareness of it to the edge of her, processing the same peripheral position where she kept the sounds of the bass around her during a shot present but not central, and she kept moving. By kilometer 8, Holloway's shoulder was failing him in earnest. She could see it from 3 positions back in the loose formation. The pack was shifting on his right side, not dramatically but consistently, as his shoulder gave up the battle of maintaining the low geometry his body needed. He was compensating with his torso, which was redistributing the weight to his lower back, which was a cascade failure developing in real time. At the current rate by kilometer 14, he would be in genuine pain. By kilometer 17, he would be a problem for the element. She came up alongside him at kilometer 8.5. Your pack is shifting, she said. He was breathing controlled but effortful. I know. Left shoulder strap needs to come down 2 inches. It'll move the load center lower and take the lateral pull off the joint. He looked straight ahead as he walked. I can manage it. You can manage it to kilometer 14, she said. After that, you're going to be carrying your lower back's failure on top of your shoulder's failure, and you'll be costing the element by kilometer 17. A pause. Their boots on the desert ground, the heat, the weight, the silence between them. 2 inches, he said. 2 inches. He reached up without stopping a technically impressive piece of coordination under load and adjusted the strap. She watched his pack settle, watched his torso geometry change, watched the compensation pattern in his torso begin to dissolve over the next 4 strides as the load found a more sustainable position. Better, she said. Yeah, he said, and his voice had something in it that was more than the acknowledgement of a physical improvement. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said. Finish. She dropped back to her position. Callahan, running the parallel vehicle track, had his window down. He had seen the exchange. He did not write anything on his clipboard this time. He just drove. Kilometer 12 brought the elevation. The climb was not dramatic by mountaineering standards, but in 65-pound kid in 104-degree heat after 11 kilometers of accumulated fatigue, it was a different animal entirely. The grade was enough to change the mechanical demand completely, every step now requiring the hip flexors and glutes to generate more force, which meant Ava's already taxed right hip flexor was now being asked for more than it had been giving. She felt it escalate through kilometer 12 and 13, classified it again, moved it to the edge again, kept the center clear for the calculation of each step, each footfall, each placement on the shifting rocky terrain of the climb. By kilometer 14, the signal had become a conversation rather than background noise. The tissue was talking to her steadily, persistently, with the kind of insistence that demanded acknowledgement even when you denied it action. She acknowledged it. She denied it action. She kept moving. Graves was at the kilometer 15 marker when she passed it, standing at the side of the track in the full heat, watching the element move through. He watched each candidate as they passed. When Ava came through, his eyes went to her gait immediately, the clinical assessment of an experienced evaluator who had been watching her move for 4 days and knew exactly what her baseline looked like. He saw the hip immediately. The left lean barely perceptible but present. The right foot strike a fraction harder than the left, a micro-compensation pattern she had been managing since the early kilometers, but which was now visible under the accumulated strain. He said nothing. He let her pass. But he turned and watched her for 30 seconds after she passed, watching the pattern, measuring its severity, running his own calculation about what he was looking at. Then he got in the vehicle and drove to the kilometer 16 marker. At kilometer 16, something happened that nobody had planned for and nobody could have prevented. Brixton went down. Not dramatically, he didn't collapse. He stepped wrong on a loose section of rock at the base of a short descent, and his right ankle rolled, and the combination of the load and the fatigue and the bad luck of the specific angle meant the joint gave in a way that was immediate and structural. He made a sound short control, the sound of a man who is in genuine pain and has trained himself to minimize its expression, and he stopped, and the element stopped around him. He was on his feet within 4 seconds. But the ankle was wrong, visibly wrong even under his boot, the way wrong ankles look when the tissue is telling you something definitive. The medical corpsman in the support vehicle was there in 30 seconds. He assessed Brixton in under a minute, and when he stood up, his expression said everything before his words did. He's done, the corpsman said. Probable grade 2. He finishes in the vehicle. Brixton looked like the information was physically painful in a different way than the ankle. He looked at the element around him, at Reyes, at Torres, at Kowalski, at Ava, in the frustration, in the helplessness, in the competitive grief of a strong man being taken out of an evolution by bad luck, were all present in his face undisguised. Element, Graves said, appearing from the vehicle at the shoulder of the track. You are now 11. The march continues. You still finish together. He paused. Move. They moved. Brixton watched them go from the vehicle, jaw set, and said nothing. The kilometer 17 climb was the hardest thing Ava had experienced in 4 days. Not physically the most demanding the heat of day two's ruck, the sustained performance of the range, the precision demand of the 1,200-meter evolution had all required different things from her. But the combination of a taxed hip flexor, accumulated 4-day fatigue, extreme heat, and the additional psychological weight of Brixton's exit created a compound pressure that was new in its specific quality. Her father had told her about this. He called it the convergence point, the moment in any sustained effort when every system in the body reaches its limit at the same time and the only thing left is the thing that isn't physical. He said everyone had a convergence point, and most people didn't know where theirs was until they hit it, and the ones who came through it were not necessarily the ones with the most physical capacity. They were the ones who had made a decision in advance about who they were going to be at that moment. She had made that decision a long time ago. She had made it the night her father told her his diagnosis, sitting in the kitchen of the house where she'd grown up, watching him tell her the news with the same steady precision he brought to everything. His hands flat on the table, his voice controlled his eyes, telling her that he was going to be afraid and that he was not going to let the fear run him. She had made her decision in that kitchen, at that table, watching her father choose who he was going to be at his convergence point. She kept moving. At kilometer 19, Graves walked beside her. He came from the vehicle and matched her pace and walked beside her on the right side, and she was aware of his presence immediately, but did not adjust her stride or acknowledge it verbally. She just kept moving. He walked beside her for 30 seconds before he spoke. "Hip flexor," he said. "Yes, sir." "How long?" "Since kilometer 4, she said. It escalated at 12. He was quiet for a moment. Their boots on the ground, the heat, the weight. "Why didn't you flag it?" She considered the honest answer, which was the only kind she gave. "Because it wasn't going to stop me," she said. "And flagging something that isn't going to stop you is noise. I don't generate noise." Another 30 seconds of silence. Then Graves said, "Your father teach you that? He taught me the principle. The application is mine." Graves walked beside her for 40 more steps. Then he said something that was entirely outside his established professional vocabulary, something she had not heard from him in 4 days and had not expected to hear. "He did his job," Graves said quietly. Not to her exactly, more like a man speaking aloud a conclusion he has just reached about something that matters. Whatever he was doing, wherever he was doing it, he did his job completely. She felt it move through her the way the truth moves when it arrives from an unexpected direction. She kept her gait steady, kept her breathing controlled. But something in the center of her chest tightened and released in a way that was not physical. "Yes, sir," she said. Her voice was level. "He did." Graves looked ahead, said nothing more. He walked beside her for another 20 steps, then peeled off back toward the vehicle. At kilometer 19.5, Reyes came up on her left side. He didn't say anything. He just moved beside her, matching her pace, Bali, and he stayed there for the last 500 meters to the finish. Torres fell in on her right at kilometer 19.7. At kilometer 19.8, Kowalski moved up from his position in the formation and placed himself directly in front of her, not blocking her path, just forward, and visible as if he was the element's bow, and she was in the formation behind him, and he was not going to let anything get to her that he could be in front of. Nobody coordinated this, nobody called it. It just happened, the organic movement of a unit making an unspoken decision about itself, about what it valued, about who it chose to protect and follow. The finish line was marked with a pair of stakes at the edge of the training ground, and the element crossed it at 13:47 hours, 20 kilometers, complete 65-pound, packs 107 degrees, 11 people who had started that morning as candidates and crossed the finish line as something harder to define and more meaningful. Ava crossed the line and stopped. For the first time in 4 days, she allowed herself to stop completely. Not a tactical pause, not a position adjustment, not a breath control moment before the next evolution. A complete stop. She stood at the finish line and she felt the hip flexor register its full complaint now that she was no longer moving, and she let it speak and she breathed. She was still standing. Reyes stood to her left. Torres to her innate, Kowalski in front turned now to face the group, his chest heaving from the effort and his face wearing an expression she had never seen from him before. Not pride, something earlier than pride and more fundamental. Something that looked like a rival. Graves stood at the finish line. He had driven ahead and been waiting when they came in, and he had watched every one of the 11 candidates cross the line, and now he looked at the group in front of him, exhausted, heat-soaked, stripped down to whatever they actually were underneath the performance and the assumption and the hierarchy, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Ava. She looked back at him. Her hip was talking to her steadily, and her legs were carrying 4 days of desert, and her pack was 65 pounds of concrete, and she was standing upright and her eyes were clear. He looked at her for a long moment. And then Jonas Graves, who did not praise in professional contexts, who did not offer personal words except to the dead, who had spent 22 years building a wall between his judgments and his sentiments, said something to her in front of the entire element and the entire cadre. He said, "Your father was right about you." Not the evaluation, not the assessment, not the program's findings or the documentation Callahan would file or the report the program coordinator would receive. Not any of the institutional language that was going to follow this day through channels and committees and official records. Just that. Your father was right about you. She held his gaze and she did not look away. And she did not let what happened in her chest show in her face, but it was there. The grief and the pride and the 4 days and the 11 years of her father's hands on a rifle teaching her when, and the morning she had driven to a hospital and come home to an empty house, and the night she had decided in a kitchen with her hands flat on a table that she was going to carry everything he'd put in her to wherever it needed to go. All of it there at the finish line. "Thank you, sir," she said, and her voice was steady and clean and entirely her own. The element did not erupt. They were too tired and too real for eruption. But something moved through the group, a collective recognition, a shared acknowledgement of what they had been part of over the last 4 days, and it settled over all of them like the shadow of something very large passing overhead. Kowalski looked at her and then looked away and set his jaw and said nothing, and that was exactly the right response from him. Callahan closed his clipboard. Reyes breathed out slowly through his nose and nodded once at the desert, not at anyone, just at the fact of it, and that was exactly the right response from him too. Graves turned and walked back toward the command building without looking back, which was exactly right from him, because the work was done and he had said the thing, and looking back would have made it smaller. She watched him go, and she thought about her father, the way he had sat at the table with his hands flat and told her the truth without dressing it up, and the way he had taken her into the desert a week later, still healthy enough to walk, and stood behind her at 800 meters, and said one last time with the particular precision of a man making sure the most important lesson will be remembered: the shot is the last 10%, Ava. Everything before it is the real job. Make sure the real job is done before you worry about the shot. She had done the real job. In the Nevada desert at 17 years old, in 4 days of heat and weight and contempt and accumulated proof, she had done everything her father had spent 11 years preparing her to do. She was still standing. And the desert, indifferent and enormous and entirely without opinion about what it had witnessed, stretched out around her in every direction under a sky that would have looked exactly the same whether she had failed or prevailed. But she had not failed, and she had not merely survived, and the men who had laughed at her on the first morning would carry what they had seen in this desert for the rest of their careers. That was not luck. That was not politics. That was not a girl who had wandered into the wrong program and gotten fortunate. That was Robert Vance's life's work, standing at a finish line in the Mojave at 17 years old, breathing steadily, hips screaming, packed still on her back, eyes clear. And it could not be taken back, could not be unseen, could not be reclassified or dismissed or sent home on a transport. It was done, it was real, and it would stand exactly as long as the truth stands, which is forever.